So what I was going to do now is I was going to have 3 to 4 questions for the panelists that I present to them. Everybody else is still up there, right? Yeah, if you could show them all, that'd be great. And then we'll do audience questions from both people here in person and those who've joined us online. So I'm going to actually combine a question that hopefully gets all 3 of you. So Dr. King and Dr. Blaine have both commented on how change in resource demands due to climate change has the potential to feed instability. And my question is, and Dr. King, you mentioned some development solutions, like ways to address this. My question is, do we actually have the capacity within the US government to adequately address some of these changes? And if we don't, what can we do to build that capacity? And then just sort of adding on to that in terms of a capacity question for Dr. Titley is, what lessons can we learn to prepare the armed forces for a changing environment? So it's basically a question for all 3 of you about institutional capacity. Do we have it? What do we need to do to build it, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure, I'm happy to start off, if that's okay. So one thing that I think is being done and could be improved to advance this issue is something called the Global Fragility Act. So the Global Fragility Act is an innovative law that has been implemented to sort of fundamentally reframe the manner that the US would approach development assistance. And this is to bring it to more of a paradigm of conflict avoidance. And so the Global Fragility Act has just been implemented and chosen 4 geographies that are very important to the United States in terms of preventing conflict there. So those areas are Haiti, I believe Libya, Mozambique, and entire Western coastal Africa. So these are regions, that have intense impacts of climate change. They weren't chosen for that reason alone, but these are areas that can first be sort of concentrated upon. And then the idea would be hopefully to have a little more funding under the Global Fragility Act in the out years going forward, and then also identifying new priority countries with, again, sort of looking through that climate lens. The USAID as well, as I had said, I think development is really this key to conflict prevention. They have a climate strategy of conflict prevention and framework for both the Department of State and USAID. And so I think that's a great step in that they are beginning to incorporate climate considerations into both diplomacy and development programs. And I think that the third piece would just be to build capacity in this area of understanding climate change, is to improve the climate literacy of people across all different agencies within the US government. So developing training programs, as they say, to get people to ask the climate question and sort of inculcate that in all that they do. But this is very important, especially to build capacity in the development sector within the US government and beyond.
I might add a little bit to what Dr. King said. I think already, Dr. King, you've raised some really critical points, including the Global Fragility Act and also the integration of kind of climate sensitivity into a lot of USAID and State Department activities. I also think that we need to integrate conflict sensitivity into a lot of the work that the US government does on climate change. It's a two-way street, and conflict sensitivity is as important as climate sensitivity, and beginning to think about what is the intersection in how we work on different fields that intersect with each other. And so beginning to think about how we support this transition to a green economy, for example, while also thinking about what it means for risks on conflict and addressing those aggressively is a key issue too. And I do think that there is more that we can be doing in the diplomatic space in particular to talk about these issues, to ensure that they're part of the conversation and so on. I mean, to some degree, Tara, you asked about the capacity within US government. And there is capacity there. Is it enough? Probably not. Do we need to hire more people who are aware of these issues and ensure that government is strengthened to take on these issues? Absolutely. That's a long-term objective, and that takes time, and it takes people who are trained and who are building experience in these issues. But at least in the short term, I do think that the US government already does have staff able to begin addressing these issues, but they also need more political support to allow them to take it on more deliberately. I'll pass it off for the next question here to Dr. Titley.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I'll just try to keep this more to the Department of Defense. I think these broader issues have been very well covered here. And this is to some degree what I tried to do when I was on active duty over a decade ago, running Task Force Climate Change in the Navy. And we had some modest success, but we had a lot of things that also did not come to fruition. If you're in the Pentagon or working in the military, I kind of mentioned in my talk readiness, and looking at climate change through what I call the lens of readiness can really help in the building. When I say the building, the Pentagon. Because if you start talking science stuff or techno things or parts per million of carbon, you're done. Nobody cares. Nobody honestly cares. But they do care if their forces are not ready. And so it has to be not only taking the science, but putting it in a way that makes sense. It's like, here's an issue, this is what you got to do, this is what it costs, and this is when you need to do it. And the when you need to do it is critical because kind of the way the budgeting process works, because the cold honest fact is, if you say there's a really big threat, but it's 20 years out, nobody's going to care. Because a lot of things can change in 20 years. If you're within 5 years or 3 years out, now you start caring, because that's when you start assigning money to either buy down risk or accepting that risk. So framing it not only in readiness, but framing it in readiness that you need to do something about now, or now being within 5 years. I think personally, it's very important to have advocates within the military who are not the political appointees. And we see this big sine wave, and it's been a big sine wave now for well over a decade. The politicals, this is a big thing, it's not a big thing. It's a big thing, it's not a big thing. When that happens, in general, the culture of the Pentagon is to duck low and let the politicians fight it out, because by and large, the Pentagon does not want to get involved in domestic politics. So having this look blatantly political is hurting. Whereas if there are real issues, I like to say, the ice doesn't care who's in the White House, whether it's Republican or Democrat or who controls Congress, it's just going to melt. So we need to both make this nonpartisan for the readiness issue, and politicians of both parties, I think, strongly support a ready military. But we also need to be able to, I think, have active duty flag and general officers and senior executive services who are currently serving. It's great to have the retired people. I got a lot of retired admirals and generals. Oh yeah, Titley, you're right. This climate thing, it's really important. And I like to say, where the hell were you guys when I was in the building and you kept your mouth shut? Because, no, we're not going to touch that. Well, as long as that happens, you don't really get motion. So you've got to have some advocates. We had Admiral Roughhead, we had Admiral Locklear. They were a decade ago. And my question, and I've asked this to the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, is who are your active duty advocates today? I did not get an answer.
Okay, thank you guys. We've got about little less than 20 minutes left. I have more questions, but I do want to give you guys time to ask them if you have them. So if you're in the room and you have a question, there's a mic here. If you are online and you have a question, start typing it in so that I can see it. So, and if nobody has a question, I will keep asking questions. So, yeah, do you want to come use the mic? I think you might have to turn it off. I'm not sure. No.
How about now? Yes, excellent.
Can you guys, the panelists, can you hear him? Okay.
On the video there, yeah, thank you. So on the science angle on this, I was curious whether you're aware of any efforts to look at potential scenarios for how one might deploy a new technology like, say, a functional fusion power plant around the globe. You know, say the US or US company develops a viable fusion plant and says, okay, we're ready to mass manufacture this and install it. Is there planning in place for deciding whether it makes sense to, you know, do you go into sharing that as widely as possible? Do you share it first with countries that are already supportive of Western democratic principles? Do you first deploy it in places that are not supportive of Western democratic principles as a way of showing, well, look, these do work and it's beneficial? Or do you say, you know, the climate is the most important thing and we have to just put it out there as much as possible, as fast as we can to, as you said, save the ice, right? So I'm curious on your perspective. It doesn't necessarily have to be fusion, but other, you know, climate solutions. Do we use them as tools for advancing other policy goals? Or do we just go after climate and let everything else sort itself out as the pressure and the conflict comes down?
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at that, and I'm sure the other panelists will have something. I would say in the real world, nothing, including climate, exists in a vacuum. So as an example, I founded, along with the Norwegians and the US European Command, something we called the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. For those who may be Arctic geeks in the room, there is an organization called the Arctic Council. It's been around since the mid-90s. And it had been reasonably successful, but one of its charters is it will not do hard security, military security. So long story short, in 2010 or 2011, we had, for the first time, the militaries of every single Arctic nation. And I'm sure most people here know that Russia has 50% of the Arctic coastline. So they're a big player. Long story short, after Crimea, the Russians were disinvited by the US government from the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable. You could argue that the Arctic, again, the ice didn't care whether the Russians are there or not. It continues to melt. We continue to have issues and security issues, and I would argue greater security issues now. But the overarching US policy was we are not going to do military to military communications with the Russians. So they have not shown up now for 6 or 7 years, and they're sure not going to be invited this year. So I would say that these types of costs and benefits are always a trade-off. Proliferation, risk, benefit, US interest of our allies and partners, and all of that gets weighed at pretty senior levels in the administration.
So one piece I would like to add to that is, you know, in some of my analysis looking at, you know, very dry countries and arid regions, including even California in the United States, is what is the role of desalination? And if desalination is going to be the key, you know, which it may be in certain areas, there could be, you know, more advances in that technology. But one of the things about desalination is it's very energy intensive. So if there was the ability to, you know, operate some of these fusion plants at the scale, you know, maybe of small modular reactors, then deployment of those in areas where especially seawater could be desalinated might be a climate solution. But then, of course, you need the associated grid infrastructure that can handle, you know, that sort of baseload power. So that might reduce it to certain countries. There are proliferation concerns, but I'm no expert in knowing, you know, what those are with the newest technologies. But I just wanted to mention that, you know, desalination with steady baseload energy that doesn't come from, you know, burning oil, gas or oil, is an exciting idea and maybe a way to alleviate some of the water stress issues that we have in very dry areas.
It seems like all of us are coming from this from very different angles. I completely agree with Dr. Titley that nothing ever happens by itself. So there's no way to just consider, implementation of this kind of energy as a climate change issue without considering the context in which that's happening. However, the thing that went directly in my mind, or where my mind went directly, was that we have yet to resolve issues of how we handle intellectual property rights. And that, I think, is a huge barrier to deployment of many different technologies around the world, in part because it's hard to control those intellectual property rights. And so the private sector may not want to deploy in certain areas when they've developed new technologies and are thinking about where to try to market some of those technologies and implement some of those technologies. And quite honestly, I think that that's one of the major barriers to increasing access to a variety of very useful technologies. A lot of developing countries want access to those technologies and want those technologies to be freely shared. A lot of the companies that did the R&D to develop those want to be paid for those technologies. And I think that this is still a huge point of tension between a variety of countries around the world about how we actually realistically share technologies and how those intellectual property rights are or are not respected.
Any other questions? I don't see any questions from the online participants. Does anyone here in this room have another question? We probably have time for one more. If not, I will ask one. Okay, I'm going to ask it. Okay, for all of you, there's a sense that the scientists have long done their part in warning policymakers and leaders on climate change risks. Aside from providing data and analysis, what role can scientists play to advocate for policy changes, or what should they keep in mind?
Well, I'll take a first cut at this one since my colleagues on the panel have kindly been willing to jump in first on other questions. I am not a scientist any longer. That's the way I started out, but I am far, far, far from being an active scientist any longer. However, I understand that a lot of scientists feel as though in order to maintain their intellectual to feel as though they're being really independent as scientists and to be trusted for their work, that they often shy away from discussions about politics for fear that that will taint their work. And I honestly think that there really needs to be more effort to talk publicly about science and to talk about what that means from a policy standpoint. It's not enough to just do the work any longer. Some of what we have discovered in the work that we were doing in Africa when I was with the US Agency for International Development is a lot of decision makers can't necessarily make the connections between this is how the physical world is changing and this is what it means for the things that I care about. And it's the intermediate place that actually influences what policymakers will do differently. They need to have somebody communicate to what they understand and are familiar with and the kinds of decision points that they know how to manage. And it's, I think, increasingly important for scientists to recognize that doing the science is all well and good, but the science is also something that we have to make decisions about. And whether we like it or not, those decisions are made in very political environments. And scientists need to do a better job of venturing into that world. In general, scientists are still seen as really trusted providers of information. I know that that doesn't feel like it a lot. after, for those of us in the climate change community, or maybe even in the public health community right now after the last couple of years. But I do think that there's a lot to say about scientists being trusted members of society. And we, as a larger community, need those members of society to speak out on issues that have implications for them as individuals as well as the rest of us. I'll stop there and let somebody else take a different viewpoint potentially.
Yeah, I'll bite at that. So I kind of agree. There's I would totally agree, Dr. Blaine, that you can't just go and say, well, here's the Keeling curve and we're at 420 parts per million, have a great day, and walk away. Nobody has any idea what that means. Or even telling them that we're at 1 degree above pre-industrial right now and we're going to 3 degrees. That still doesn't mean anything to almost anybody. So you do have to translate it. I've testified a dozen times before the Congress on this issue. There's a saying that if you can't figure out who the sucker is at the poker table, it's probably you. And that sort of goes for politicians as well. Nobody's inviting you because you look good and you sound nice. They're inviting you to testify to further their aims, not yours. So you're being used. And I wrote about this in a Dedalius article that got published a few years ago. So I think that scientists need to be politically savvy and politically savvy enough to stay away from the politics. You can lay out options. And honestly, one option for climate is take the risk, right? Just keep burning fossil fuels. It's sort of the Bjorn Lomborg approach, which people hate. But it's the take the risk, get rich, and we'll deal with it later. That is an option. I don't personally think it's a good option, but it's an option. But we also need to, and that is a different policy from we don't understand the science is wrong, you guys are cooking the books. That's just nonsense and that's silly. And scientists should push back very hard at that because those are falsehoods. Or we could say they're lies, whichever you prefer. So we need to be able to do that. We need to be able to lay out different, or implications of policies, or this is what you put at risk. And if you don't do something, you're going to lose X. New York City with sea level rise, whatever X is. You're from New York District, you might care about that. So you need to be able to lay those out. But I have also seen well-known climate scientists on the campaign trail, and then somewhat surprised when the other party thinks that they're working for, the other party, because they are. So, and then it's like, why don't they trust me? I'm a scientist. They're supposed to love me. It's like, well, maybe because you're campaigning for the other party. So it's a balance, right? And everyone has to figure it out. In the military, when you raise your right hand, you consciously give up some rights that normal civilians have. We do not, in fact, ask that of scientists. So it is a personal decision. I do think it's useful, very useful to say, this is what the science has. And then when you're pressed or you want to give your personal recommendation on policy, that's what you can do. But people can and will disagree, and there can be good faith, very strong disagreements within the science community, both within communities and within individuals. So it's a great question. The worst thing you can do as a scientist is not think about it, because if you rise to some level of prominence, you will be put in this situation, and you really have consciously thought through how you want to manage this, because otherwise it will manage you.
You don't have to answer, Marcus, unless you want to. I just want to give you opportunity to.
Yeah, quickly. So this will be said as someone who doesn't have scientific training, unlike the other panelists I know who do. One of the most important things is communicating scientific findings in policy language, that's easily understood by policymakers. Writing op-eds is another way to do that. Maybe applying for grant money and programs that also relate to the social sciences, to be able to communicate those findings. And what Admiral Titley said, testifying before Congress is a very direct way to communicate messages to them. But I would say science is cool. Don't forget that science is cool. And if you're doing so, think about ways of communicating your views and findings that appeal to wider audiences, to younger audiences. For example, I appeared on Bill Nye Saves the World, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from the young people. And the young people, they're the decision makers of tomorrow. So just reaching out as much as you can through sort of non-traditional channels to really reach these young people.
Thank you. All right, we only have 2 minutes left, which is, I feel like, not enough time for them to answer a question. Do you have a very quick question? Okay, you got to come up here and use the mic.
Yeah, thank you. I missed part of the talk, so I'm not sure maybe you've addressed this, but I was wondering about the corporate influence on policies that directly oppose climate change ones. And I was wondering what you think scientists can actually do to oppose those, which are probably the biggest obstacle to climate change, not the science. And so yeah, I just think that how do you compare the so you say scientists should just keep doing science, but how does that have enough power against the billions or millions that corporations can fuel into lobbying to oppose climate change policies?
Thank you. Real quick.
I'll take a real quick answer at that. There are scientists who that's what they do. Just Google Naomi Oreskes and the doubt of climate change, and you'll see she publishes a lot. There are actually quite a few scientists who work that. My view is it's not ExxonMobil that has stopped us from doing climate. It's the fact that we really like to drive our cars, and we get our gas from Exxon and all those people. So, yes, the corporations certainly have not been helpful in many instances, but I think we're fooling ourselves if that's what we think is the reason that we have not made progress on climate. There are real issues, and we really like dense energy that's very transportable, and that's what we got to get ourselves on.
Cheryl pointed out to me that I actually have 10 more minutes. I did my math wrong. So if somebody else wants to answer that question, feel free to. Okay,
I don't have a good answer to that.
That's all right.
I find it a horrifying situation, and I don't have a good answer to it. So I'm going with what Dr. Titley said.
Okay, anybody else out there have any questions? We have 10 minutes, so.
Actually, yeah. I'll just, since we have a couple minutes, I'm going to jump in with one thing that I think we found as being effective for this. And it is sort of what you would call inoculation or pre-rebuttal of disinformation. And there are some papers published. I don't have the reference, but again, look in Google Scholar, and you can find them. They have been written, I think they were published in 2017, 2018. And we honestly saw this work very effectively pre-Ukraine war. One of the things this administration, in my personal view, did right is release a lot of intelligence that normally is not released to the public, that really, even before Putin was able to make up his lies, we were able to show the world that what the Russians, in fact, were doing. And this sort of idea of inoculation or pre-rebuttal, whatever you would like to call it, I think is quite powerful. And I think it's something that the climate community writ large, both scientists and policymakers, can do to try to counter still the disinformation that's out there. I think we see more now a delaying tactic. We see not really that much that says, oh, climate change isn't happening or we don't know why, but now it's more it's too little or it's not happening long enough. And eventually the story will become, well, you guys were right, but now it's too late, so we're not going to change anyways. But that's my forecast of the last chapter of the disinformation story.
Okay, we had one more question over here.
Hi, so I also came in a little bit late, but to play off the two questions that have been asked before, I came from the snowmass summary, and snowmass is a high energy physics example where I think the convening of many brilliant minds and hundreds of white papers have led to policy recommendations that have garnered significant support in Congress. So I know we know as physicists how to do this, but it takes a lot of effort. My question is, for a long time we've known that data doesn't convince people. So my question to you is, what does?
Stories. You know, make it individual, make it stories. I've given a public talk hundreds of times, and I've got the data and graphs and stuff. The part that people remember from my talk is I have a before and an after picture of my personal house on the Mississippi Gulf Coast before and after Katrina. And I show them, if you ever want to know what a 30-foot storm surge does coming up your street, here it is, because picture A, there's the house, and picture B, there's about 3 pieces of wood with me looking at it. And that makes more of an impact than all the IPCC reports.
I fully agree with that. And I would add that just in our experience kind of working with not necessarily policy people at the highest levels, but more with people working at local levels on how they move forward in particular areas, is oftentimes learning to speak their language. A public health person doesn't necessarily connect how rising sea levels would contribute to greater exposure to salt and therefore a greater risk of strokes. But if you can actually talk in public health terms about how sea level rise increases salt levels and has public health impacts, then they understand what their decision-making frame needs to be. And so understanding where they have to make decisions and how they have made decisions and how to speak to those decision points is a really valuable skill. It's not just about sharing the data. It's not just about sharing the charts, just like what has been said. It's those stories hit people where they actually are and thinking about the actual decisions that they have to make and how you can help inform those decisions and round out their understanding of the options in front of them is really critical.
Okay, we don't have any online questions still. Are there any other questions from the audience? I can do the last question. We've got 5 minutes left. So my question for all 3 of you is, what keeps you up at night or gives you hope? You can choose.
So I'll jump in first while others are thinking. I'll go for the what gives me the most hope, and this goes back to my last answer about the youth. It's just seeing how engaged young people are on the climate issue, especially, but on all aspects of environmental degradation and environmental safety. So, the Greta Thunberg out there is just one example. But, what really makes me feel good about the future is that I know the young people won't stand for it. They won't stand for sort of the bad, the bad decisions that we've made so far, and they're becoming more and more educated on these issues. And so it really gives me some hope that, going forward, the young people are going to be able to come up with some of these solutions, and maybe even technical solutions, technologies.
I would second a lot of that. I feel like I grew up in a generation that was a bit cynical about what it could actually accomplish. And I am really excited to see a younger generation who seem to have much more belief in their power to affect change. And it's translating into people applying and attending graduate programs in environmental policy. It's translating into many ways that they're orienting their lives around working on these issues. And that gives me hope. And then on a personal level, just seeing my own children begin to take interest in their natural world and understand how they fit into that, that brings me hope at a very individual level as well.
Yeah, I think I had it in my slide at the first slide at the bottom. I really do think we'll muddle through, sort of like the Brits did in World War II. We have certainly faced big crises in human history before, and we make it through at the other end, sometimes at considerable cost. You know, Europe lost, what, a third of their population in the Black Death, but they made it through. Hopefully we won't lose a third of our population. But we'll figure this out. The technologies, you know, are kind of there. They're there right now. And my guess is there are more than a few people at this conference and maybe in this room who are really working at energy even beyond wind and solar. And if we could have safe, unlimited energy, I think we're gonna get there. I mean, I like to tell people, and it's not my original phrase, but you know, we did not leave the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. And we're not going to leave the fossil fuel age because we run out of fossil fuel. We're going to have something better. How fast it comes, I think, is still to be determined. But what keeps me up at night is not even climate so much. It's really how much of habitat are we going to intentionally allow for the rest of the world, the non-human world? Because we probably still don't really understand all the ecosystem services that we get from genetic diversity and biodiversity. And if you kill that off, I mean, it will come back, but it'll take tens of millions of years. And I don't know that that's an experiment that we want to run. So yes, we need to get the climate under control, and I think we will. I don't know if it's 1.5, but we'll get it under control. But we really need to think about how we coexist with the natural world, because, you know, I think we're running a huge risk if we kill off everything else and think there's just one set of genes, human genes, that are gonna survive. My guess is we're really putting ourselves at massive risk there, and probably not an experiment we want to do. So I'll just end there.
All right, well, let's say thank you to our speakers one last time. Thank you all.